Stafetele, sei mir raschen Jachel fall, in mein Städtele, sei mir raschen Jachel fall, in mein Städtele, und allein meiner finstere Scheibele, sitzt dort vertreuend und deiget mein Weibele, sitzt dort vertreuend und deiget mein Weibele. Freck, was macht die Angele, Leitsche und Rivele, sog sie ich wein, und ich kusch sehr Brivele, sog sie ich wein, und ich kusch sehr Brivele.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Yiddishkayt's latest installment of our In Conversation With series, a production of Yiddishkayt, and I am Rob Adler Peckerar, the executive director of Yiddishkayt, and it's really a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to sit with us in conversation with a fantastic young author, Moriel Rothman-Zecher. He is the author of two novels now. The first novel is Sadness is a White Bird, for which he received the National Book Foundation's 535 honor, among many other awards. He now teaches creative writing at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and his new novel, which is here, Before All the World, was published by FSG, and it was released just this past Tuesday. And his work has appeared in many various publications, including Barrel House, Colorado Review, The Common, New York Times, Paris Reviews Daily, and he's the recipient of 2 McDowell Fellowships. And the way I got to know Moriel is that he was a recipient of Yiddishkayt's Wallis Annenberg Helix Fellowship, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about later this evening. So welcome, Moriel.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here. It feels like such a joy and an honor to get to do one of my very first launch events for this book in the context of Yiddishkayt, in the context of Helix. We'll talk about this more, but my time as a Helix Fellow, my time as part of the Yiddishkayt project was absolutely instrumental to what this book ultimately became.
Well, that's great. I'm really excited to hear you read from this incredible book. Maybe we should start there. Would you like to read an excerpt of for us tonight?
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
So the book, Before All the World, follows 3 characters. 2 of them, Gittel and Leib, are Yiddish-speaking immigrants from a fictional shtetl in northeastern Ukraine called Zatelsk. And they are the only survivors of a pogrom carried out there in the time of the Russian Revolution, in 1919 specifically, by Ukrainian nationalist forces in one of many pogroms in that era, in which some historians estimate up to 200,000 Jews were killed. They both separately make it to Philadelphia of the 1930s and reconnect there. In Philly, they link up with Charles, who's a Black communist writer, translator, ghostwriter, and the 3 of them navigate America's often nightmarish sexual and racial politics. And one more thing about the book before I read a quick excerpt is that it is framed as a translation. The book is a translation of Gittel's manuscript by Charles. So the book itself has multiple frames going on, but all you need to know for now is that when I do this, when I hold up a finger, it means I'm reading a footnote. So I'll read a chapter from early on in the book. This is a few chapters in, and it's called A Maaseh fin Zatelsk, or Story of Zatelsk. And so, Leib was the youngest of 3 children, after Zanvil and Sprinzel, born to Mirele and Shulam Usharol in the dust village what was known as Zatelsk. Zatelsk was bifurcated by a murkish river of melted snow and weeds what looked like clumps of hair, and boasted a resplendent graveyard filled with dozens of anxious dead, almost all of what died on their very own days. Each evening in Zatelsk, as the sun crept into the swollen night, Chayele the mouse maker would walk to the edge of the forest, tongue pouch in hand and handy incantations on tongue, and would lead a portion of Zatelsk's population in negotiations with the death malach, what is made from only eyes, the veinish stalks of what are together braided like lumpen coils of uncooked egg-drippish Shabbos dough, and they were fierce and slippery, the eye stalks and the negotiations. But Chayele and the other Jews knew from haggling, knew from planting tongues inside the earth at the edge of the forest, such that the multitudinous eyes, what opened wider as the night slurmed inward unto Zatelsk, might be distracted by the gray and pink squiggles of flesh, out poking between pine fingers and lolling about in patches of sorrel, mint and sorrel and wild horseradish and severed tongues. Look at the tongues and away from us, Omain. And in this way, most of the people in Zatelsk could remain living and safe like a fat brown Hebrew baby jammed into a barely leaking swaddle of reeds, slurring about in the winter Nile, piranhish and crocodilish and humanish nibblings below, be goddamned. Most mornings in Zatelsk, most people would wake with crumbles of sleep in their eyes, alive, awake, Omain, and then would either go daven the dawn prayers or snuggle under the blankets for a feathery shtip, depending, of course, on the density of the icicles lilting outside the windows like puffy, translucent tongues, not of chickens in this case, but of albino weed snakes, and on the badness of the dreams dreamed the night before about leprous, limbless lizards and other subjects, and on whether these dreams called out to be strengthened and fortified and whispered into the field of your lover's eardrum, or if they needed healing, and for the Lord let what turned Bilam's curse from a curse to a blessing, to do the same for the dreamer's dream, to make swords into sewing needles, to make czars and pharaohs into toads, their edicts into toadstools, their men into toadstools, their rifles into toadstools, their nooses into sphygmomanometers, what the people of Zatelsk knew from, for the people of Zatelsk were not dumb of modernity, The people of Zatelsk knew the usefulness of such scientific tools, what might peep their steelish heads into a Jew's private most spleens and livers, knew also that being hanged was not generally good for a Jew's health. The morning activities also depended, of course, on the collaborators the denizens of Zatelsk found in their various cousins or friends or palms or fingertips or gods. On most mornings, as the light bled into the rooms, would of course prefer to flop or waltz or glide, as each case may be, for the methods and manners of shtipping were as varied in the village of Zatelsk as in any Bohemian metropolis, and perhaps more so given that a good measure of creativity was required in a village of 312, where even the faithless fornicators like Gittel the slaughterer's daughter and rabbit-eyed Itzel the orphaned porter ran out of options before half a single head month could pass, and found themselves in each other's goose-pimpled arms more milkish mornings than not. Of course, preferences notwithstanding, for as any half-wit who has done at least a bissel of learning knows, only a malich gets to shtip as often as they want. Most mornings, most of the men made their way to Zatelsk's only shill, God house, where they would shokel, forward thrust, their hips toward Jerusalem, and most of the women, finding no deep delight in the act of staring at the backs of the men's necks from the crevice of the shill's posterior, would make as if to start the day in tandem with their husbands, pretend to busy themselves with some task or other, tasks what were anyway more foreign than desert-scrubbed Targum Lushan, literally translation tongue, in other words, Aramaic. The construction of this word mirrors that of the superlatively familiar Mama Lushan, or Mama tongue, in other words, Yiddish, suggesting perhaps both a parallel and a chasm between the translational and the familial. One of my hopes with this translation, it might be noted, is to bridge that chasm. Unto the men, until they, the men, left, their prayer shawls smelling of mold and lilacs in their hands, their dawn-emboldened putzes slowly wilting in their trousers, and then many of the women of Zatelsk would back-crawl to one wheatish bed mat or another, alone or with company, and so it came to pass that the women of Zatelsk, in fact, found methods and means to shtip, in one sense or another, far more frequently than did the men. In this way, perhaps, Zatelsk was unique. Or perhaps not. Before the morning prayers were over and after the morning shtipping had finished, many of the women would spark a fire and let dance in the pan just a few pinches of sorrel and a snippet of thyme or two, and the room would smell appetizing for when the men returned, allowing said men to make the belief that their various valor wives held their gastronomic well-being as sacrosanct, and this way the people of Zatelsk were happy. Of course, no one in Zatelsk was happy. Happiness being a modernish, blasphemous ambition, but content. The people of Zatelsk were content. Even young Leib had been content enough in his misery. Unlike the other boys in Cheder, he didn't care to talk about America's feelings or her head-sized, globulent jugs of money, nor did he care to discourse about the smaller, more proportional teats of the Maideles of Zatelsk, nor would he have cared to do so at a later stage of his boy times, even if he had reached those times in Zatelsk. Leib was not even interested in the classical after-Cheder method of profiteering, in what a bucher, boychik, would offer Burich Bendit Asnes a sweep of his workshop for next to nothing, with the knowledge that Burich Bendit was usually too drunk to recall if he'd already paid said enterprise-ish Bucher, and thus could be convinced to twice pay the agreed-upon sum, or 4 times, or, as in the famous case of an impish Jewlet, what was called Schmerel, 14 times for the very same sweep. You may believe it or don't. Originally, Ihr Megd das Gleben oder Nein. Possible nod to the schmaltzy Yiddish theater song, which bears almost the same name, and of which the author once did a rendition. An astonishing moment, in truth. The only time I recall ever hearing Gittel sing. But so Leib was gloomishly content to wander the fields with his friends, the hedgehogs and fire ants of Zatelsk, sitting down with them by the north banks of the splendid Zatelska River for a breakfast of berries and smoked herring, pondering with them about the ways of the world, dreaming about joyous boys, sprinkling on their variously spikesome and pottish heads a fistful of raisins with almonds each time the critters would unravel a difficulty. All the while staying clear of the forest with all-sided Zatelsk, knowing, like any Jew knew, that this was where the death Malach made from only eyes waited, and also wild beasts like lynxes and bears, but of course not knowing what would happen when the clan of death came. Thank you.
All right, I'm not sure even where to begin, but let's start here. I want to just focus on one thing that always popped up for me in the course of reading and rereading this work of yours is the centrality of the tongue, both kind of the physical tongue, the human bodily tongue, but then also the idea of tongues in the book. And it comes up in our translator's footnote right there with the question of Talgum Lushan, the Lushan, the tongue, versus Mame Lushan, the mother tongue. And the statement that you say here, or that our translator says about the desire to bridge the chasm. So I'm wondering about that. The chasm here is between the language of the translation, the language of the translator, the language of the maternal, homey, intimate language, and the language of the reader. How are you bridging that chasm? How does Charles, our translator, bridge that chasm? What is happening in the chasm?
Thanks, Rob, for that question. I think that one of the central questions of this book that, and the gift of this being a novel, is that I don't have to answer it. 2 of the characters can argue with each other, and I don't have to decide which one I agree with, is whether there is something essential to any tongue. Whether there is a tongue that can cause something, whether there is a tongue that can lead to something, whether there is a tongue that necessarily contains more humor or more coldness, more joy, more grace, more fear. And there's a moment actually later in the book, it's in which the two characters actually have this argument out on the page, where Charles, for whom Yiddish is a second language, it's a learned language, one he learned as a teenager and then is still learning in the process of this book, in the process of translation. He says, maybe there's something ultimately freer about the Yiddish, something that can't be oversat into American. And Gittel, for whom Yiddish is her native language, responds, no, all tongues are the same upground human fish, I think. There is no such holy mama tongue, what helps any person to do anything or to be anything, or what keeps a person from anything. Also, if we're oversitting into American all the way, Yiddish just is Jewish, and Jewish with a small letter, yeah.
And what is your take on that in relation to Gittel and Charles, right? I mean, it's interesting because when you put this on paper, you have the word oversat, right? And so already Charles saying something like to oversat, which is your calc, your direct translation, literal translation of übersetzen, to translate, to literally to set over, to sit over. You're doing something else by hewing so closely to the sounds and the feel of the actual Mameloshen. So what is happening in terms of what you're doing there? How do you see that? Yeah.
So for me, I didn't arrive at an answer in the 5 years of working around and through and in this book. I didn't arrive at a take as to whether there are essential qualities to Yiddish that make it freer or that make it more humorous or that make it more melancholic. But what I did was I drew from the well of poetry, where one doesn't have to arrive at an answer in order to explore sounds, in order to explore syntax, in order to explore how words explode and push against one another. And so part of the project of this book was to see what would happen if I allowed the characters and allowed the book itself to create a kind of amalgam tongue, to, like you said, to borrow at some points very directly, to make calques from actual Yiddish, and other points to make up words that may have approximate original meanings or may be totally fictionalized, but in some ways are drawing from this same wellspring, which I'm imagining I'm drawing from. I mean, there was also it was a non-linear process in writing it, because I actually set out to write this book. We spoke about the gift of doing this this kind of talk online, is that I can kind of lift up books and show them quite directly without they're being tiny and in the distance. So the process of writing this book actually started with this book. So this is
Ruth Whitman.
I was at an artist's residency in New Hampshire called MacDowell, and I just finished writing my first novel. I put the final touches on the edits and sent it back to my editor, and I'd gotten advice from a more experienced writer, which was, by the time your first novel comes out, you should already be working on something new. And it was brilliant advice. And, I think the idea is to save the little authorlet from spending their days refreshing Goodreads and Instagram and whatever other purgatory in which one could find themselves after the publication of the book. And in what another friend of mine once called, she called the period before publication the calm before the calm. Ultimately, we are talking about books here.
And we're going to come back to Goodreads in a second. So just to get that right.
All right. But so I said, well, what am I working on? And I was wandering around the beautiful library at MacDowell. It's the James Baldwin Memorial Library. And somehow this book kind of glanced at me from off the shelf. And the translator, Ruth Whitman, had been a fellow at MacDowell in, I believe, 1963. So, a full half century and then some before I even picked up this book. And so the poems that she was labeling modern Yiddish poetry were, of course, modern to the 50s, modern to the early 60s. But reading these poems was like reading the work of family. And I don't mean that primarily in the parochial sense. I don't mean family because that because they were Jewish, or family because my great-grandparents also
Right.
spoke Yiddish and wrote in Yiddish. I mean, family on the literary level. I mean, family on the sort of the human level. I'll read a snippet now of Yankov Glatstein, or Jacob Glatstein. And this is in Whitman's translation. All the children, astonished, ran to meet the fear of death, without tears, like little Jewish bedtime stories, and soon they flickered into flames, like small namesakes of God. Who else, like me, has his own nighttime dead garden? Who is destined for this, as I am? Who has so much dead earth waiting for him as for me? And when I die, who will inherit my small house of death, and that shining gift, an eternal death day light, forever flickering? And reading this, I felt this profound longing to talk with Glatstein, to talk with Anna Margolin, to talk with Rachel Korn, to talk with Manger, to talk with Halperin. And that's the gift of poetry. The gift of poetry and literature is that time starts to bend on itself when you're writing in conversation with someone. It's not so important when I'm writing the beginnings of a conversation with Glatstein in this little cabin in the snowy woods in New Hampshire in 2017. It doesn't matter so much that he was writing 70 years before me. It's not so relevant that he's no longer alive and I happen to be alive at the moments I was writing, because at some point I won't be alive either.
Right. And he's speaking to you right now through the page.
But this is the but where that connects back to this book and the project of this book is I read everything on the right side of the page. Right? I only read in the translated side. I couldn't even really sound out the Yiddish. I speak Hebrew, so I could make out the letters, but I didn't know how the Kometz Aleph. I didn't even know it was called a Kometz Aleph. I didn't know how the Yiddish letters were pronounced, and so I started writing this kind of faltering conversation. And there are some early drafts of that same chapter I read, which came from that winter at McDowell. But then I said pretty quickly, I want to stop. I'm going to stop the writing for a while and learn the language, learn this language that I'm writing toward, learn this language that these poets who I admire so deeply were writing in. The same way I would if I found these family members writing in French. It would be upon me to learn French. If I found them writing in Russian, it would be upon me to learn Russian. And I found them writing in Yiddish. And so then coming back to it 5 years later, I can read the sounds, and I can read that Glatstein also wrote Alle kleine Kinder seien verwundert, gelaufen dem Teutschreck entgegen, ungewohnen, wie verwigte jüdische Meiselech kleine. Und bald haben sie aufgeflackert in Flämmlich, wie kleine Adoshemlich, and onwards. And the words become not only the approximate meaning. I don't only have them in translation, but I have both. I have this conversation between Whitman and Glatstein. I have the conversation between my own writing and both of them. I have the conversation between these two languages, perhaps even these three languages, if we can call the made-up dialect of the book its own. Not a language, let's call it a dialect. And of course, this connects very directly to my conversation with Yiddishkayt and my conversation with you, Robbie, that in the process of learning the language and wanting to learn this culture, I stumbled across the Helix Fellowship. And actually, it was forwarded to me by a dear friend, Sarah Nahar, who isn't Jewish, but saw it on a mailing list and said, "This looks great. What do you think about this? These folks seem like they have awesome politics. They're doing cool projects related to art. Why don't you send in an application?" And so fast forward a bunch of years, I got to spend time with the group in Belarus. I got to explore the places where some of these poets I loved so dearly were writing. I got to explore the places where my own great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents lived and worked and loathed and shtipped and borrowed and laughed and farted and haggled and everything that a person does, rather than sort of some melancholic, lugubrious concept of a person. And then there was this back and forth. And of course, I would be remiss if I don't mention here our delightful, sprawling conversation that we had over the course of a number of years and through a lot of the early days of the pandemic, mostly over what we called our Yiddish red phone, where we would Viber. We would text on Viber, and I would ask. We would go back and forth about idioms, and we would go back and forth about dialect, and we'd go back and forth about how exactly to place the dialect of Zatelsk, in which it would draw from some elements of Polish Yiddish and other elements of Litvish Yiddish, and also would be geographically correct to have been in the pathway of the most severe Ukrainian pogroms of 1919 and 1920, and really this sprawling, magnificent text, which is hard to recreate because it's this big on a little app, but it was such a gift to be in conversation with you then and now. So
we'll come back to some of these little strands in a second. I'm interested also, just like returning to that question of, you also pointed at this sort of a chasm between the right side of the page and the left side of the page. Do you think that what you created, the language, I don't know if I'd call it a dialect, I mean, the sub-language, the pseudo-language, the language that you created, is that part of the bridging, or is it something else, the kind of between that left side of that page, the right side of the page, what you've produced? Where is that now? How does that chasm look to you now after these years of engaging with Yiddish? And then the other question I just want to throw out there too for you is, one of the things that you just said that I love, because of the types of people we work with specifically at Yiddishkayt, are often people who don't have, biological, ancestral history that relates directly to Eastern and Central European Jewish life, but are drawn to it. They affiliate with it. It's an elected affiliation.
Yes.
And what you're talking about here is really, even though, notwithstanding your ancestral heritage, you also felt a kinship with the writers that you were drawn to first on that right side of the page, or left side of the page.
Right side in this book.
Right side in that book, right. The one that reads from left to right, and then made the move to the other side of the page. So I'm interested in how all those things work together, those acts of affiliation, the affiliation with the poets, who you choose to affiliate, who your chosen family of poets are. And then what happens over time, the more that you are working with these materials, that bridges the difference between the right and the left.
So I love that question. And as you were framing that question, I sort of opened the book and started to place my hand between the page. And I sort of thought to myself that maybe my book does exist sort of here, like along the sort of bumpy, sloppy ridges of the seam. That it does feel like not a bridge so much as it, neatly connects the two, but almost something earthier and stranger. Piles of rocks thrown across this river, weeds that are floating back and forth between either side, something that exists in this strange, world of glue and binding and roughness. But certainly there is a project that the translator takes on in this book, in conversation with the author, and a project that I was, thrilled. I think at some point, and this is, where it gets a little strange talking about fiction. At some points, I think I was kind of leading the project of saying like, well, why don't you all try this? And then at a later stage, I felt like I was following their project. Mm-hmm. But I do think that the book tries to exist in this seam land between Yiddish and English, and to see what comes out when sometimes syntax is borrowed, and sometimes words are borrowed, sometimes framings are borrowed, sometimes idioms are borrowed, sometimes they're translated, other times they're not. Sometimes they have deep sourcing, other times they stem from the world of imagination and feeling and sound. And that to me was, that was an act of conversation with ancestors, with literary ancestors. And I think that my hope is that there's an invitation in this book for anyone to claim these poets as their ancestors. Mm-hmm. Anyone who connects to the poetic sensibility of these poets, anyone who finds music in their words, anyone who feels echoes of some part of themselves ringing from 100 or 80 or 60 years before in these lines, translated or untranslated. And there's also the invitation in the book for readers to feel the language along their tongue. And so I think often of the novelist Arundhati Roy, who said in an interview, and I'm paraphrasing here, that her novels, particularly the newer novel, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, contains a lot of non-English transliterated into English, and that is present in the book, sometimes translated, other times not. Cultural references and religious references. And she said something like, to read this novel is to enter this ocean as a fish. And there are some fish who will swim closer to the ocean floor, and they'll see a word, and that to them will trigger a different poem and will have this connotation and that context and this resonance. And other fish will see those same words, and they'll be swimming closer to the surface of the ocean. And for them, these words will just be sound.
Yeah.
And there's not a better way for a fish to be in the ocean. There's not a superior or inferior reading experience. And actually, I think in some ways, my hope is that this book, for readers who don't know Yiddish, who don't have the context of Yiddish, they'll have the opportunity to just exist with the sounds of the words, right? They can just sit with maise, just sit with taive, without having to know that maise means story or happening, without having to know that taive means lust or urge, but just to let those syllables, those consonants exist one after another. And of course, in the book, and for those who see the text, you'll see that I don't italicize any Yiddish words or Yiddish-ish words. I didn't in my first novel either, but in this one, all the more so, because I think italicization can sort of be a nod to foreignness, or even worse, to something unessential, something incidental. And I know that as a reader, if I see an italicized section of text in a language I don't know, I'll kind of scurry forward on the page, and I'll say, like, well, are they going to translate for me? Or maybe I can just skip ahead. It's italicized and almost bracket it off. Why should I try to break my teeth, as the Hebrew saying goes? Why should I try to break my teeth on sounds I don't know? But when the text matches the other text, and you have, words following, on either side, it'll be nestled in between words that you know or you half know. I just opened a random page, and here's where Gittel is remembering someone from her village as follows: Maria shel temer riddles, storyteller what was making the after Shabbos glimmer, Burichdai no emes, Omein. Yo, it was also playing the balalaike for all the women, Omein, Owa. And that was opens to a random page, and there will be words that for every reader of English are totally familiar, and for folks who don't know Yiddish, totally unfamiliar, and folks who know some Yiddish, partially familiar and partially not. And the invitation is that the words exist not only as approximate meaning, but also as things unto themselves.
It's so interesting because, like, your book is situated or presents itself as a translation, right? And it's but it's not, it's yours and not an actual translation. But it is a translation of sorts, as we're talking about. And it's so fascinating for me as who works as a translator from Yiddish into English to hear you talk in this way, particularly. There's so much of when I'm working in translation, especially because of the people who I think I translate to a certain extent, so much of what I do is trying to make it, is to not break the teeth of the reader. So much of it is about the ease and comprehension to make people recognize something universal or in the poetry that calls to them in the poetry itself, as opposed to having to think of it as being really super culturally specific, right? That there's this way that often specific cultures, including in Southeast Asia, like in Arundhati Roy's case, or in other places, like it's a for us, by us kind of literature approach. And it's interesting, I remember recently when I submitted a manuscript and there was a question, I had translated something, and actually I think we talked about this too when I was writing it, the translation about this question about, I had translated at one point in the book the words Shabbos as Sabbath. And both you and my editor wrote me back and said, don't you think this should be Shabbos to be closer to the Yiddish? And I said, I don't know. I have to figure out a way of navigating that level of difficulty. And for me, the mark was what appears in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. If Shabbos is there, I'm okay with it. But of course, the words that you're choosing, the word choices, even in the invented words, sometimes they're obviously not going to be found. They'd have to go on a real hunt to find what those words are for the everyday reader. And how does that stand? It sits in the mouth in a particular way. It does become difficult for the unaware reader or the not knowing reader. And so I'm interested in that question of difficulty. So much of what I feel like I do is to unburden the reader. Make this realize like these aren't very specific. You can access this from anywhere, and in certain ways you're saying you can access this from anywhere, and these things can exist in your mouth in whatever way. But I'm not going to make it easy for you.
So I've been thinking about that question a lot in over these past 5 years, but also over these past 2 days, as I've been stumbling through trying to talk about this book. And a novelist I love, Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist, said once in a talk that at best, when the writer's finished, she only halfway knows what it is that she's written. And I really resonate with that. But so as you were saying this word difficult, I found myself doing the thing that I did as I was inventing this book, which was to make up a word to kind of play with it. And I was like, well, what if it was different cult? Doesn't quite work. Right. That one wouldn't pass muster. It wouldn't exist. But I think that what I mean there is that more than it is it's certainly not meant to be difficult. It's not difficult for difficulty's sake. It's not this sort of aggressive project that says, try harder in order to crack the code of our special language or to sort of get the true meaning, the marrow out of this book. But it's a different reading experience. And it's different in which it's an invitation to say, spend more time on a word. Not because it's hard, but sometimes because it's strange. And for me, the book is actually immensely playful in its language. There's almost nothing funny in the content. There's very little to laugh at or to even to smile at in terms of what happens in the book, in terms of the story, in terms of the excruciating and, at least in the framework of this book, mostly unspeakable.
Maybe only laughing with lizards. I don't know. I think that's how you translate it.
Laughing with leeches.
Leeches.
Lacht mit Jascherkes.
Yeah.
Which is an amazing Yiddish expression I came across, which is one who laughs in order to mask the screaming of their soul. So maybe in the text itself, it's only people who are, it's only lachen mit Jascherkes. It's only laughing with leeches, but the text itself, and so this is, I just opened to maybe the 10th page of the book. This is page 13, and here it's talking about Leib when he first meets Charles, and Leib, it goes, Leib knew only to sense Jew or Goy by just opening his nostrils, and so nostrils flared. Leib did right away sense that the man what had in-walked just behind him was not a Jew, lacking as his scent was in that particular underhum of mashed seven fish. You're knowing to speak Jewish? Leib said in American. Don't look so verwundert, said the man. I'm not surprised from anything, Leib said. Only I wanted to tell you that Fegele just is meaning bird. And so for me, there is even as there's almost nothing to laugh at in most of the pages, there is play on almost every single page.
Right.
And there is the playfulness and the lightheartedness of the absurdity of this project that we all take upon ourselves, which is to try to translate the human experience into spoken language or written language. And it is an absurd project. And it's absurd that we so often forget that everything is a translation. Yeah. Every word we say is a translation of the unsayable, is a translation of experience, is a translation of existence. And so there's so much play between the characters in the realm of language, on the page in terms of how the language sounds. And so I don't think that the book is difficult. Obviously, what do I know? Because I can't be a reader of this book. But it certainly isn't meant to be difficult. And it's been a really joyful experience for me to hear folks who don't know a word of Yiddish to say how much fun they found parts of it, and how parts were joyful and made them laugh out loud. And there's a play in the language and in the languaging of the book.
Yeah. Hey, well, we're still just on the subject. I just want to go to a question from our audience, from someone who we both know. Jerry Lieblich asks, in the act of translation or mistranslation or interpretation or conversation or what have you, what forms of resistance did you encounter from the language, the characters, the distance in time and place and tongue, And how did you meet that resistance? What did it generate or stymie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a magnificent question. I think that first and foremost, there is this sort of internal resistance that I had toward Yiddish, period. That in thinking about Yiddish, I grew up, I was born in Jerusalem, born in Israel, Palestine, grew up mostly in America, but grew up with this kind of twinned loathing of the Yiddish language. You know, the Israeli in me saw it as the bent back language of the diaspora, the tongue of the sheep to slaughter. And the American in me saw it as embarrassingly Jewy, too much schmuck and schmutz and putz and so on. And both of those elements led me to an aversion of Yiddish that was quite deep seated. So I think the first barrier was sort of climbing over that and figuring out how to read Yiddish in a way that was not lugubrious, that was not scornful, that was not, but nor was it romanticizing, nor was it sort of saying like, what a magical language, or every utterance is an utterance of holiness, and every sentence someone says is actually a declaration of their true allegiance to socialist utopia, and so on, right? So there's that kind of romancing that can happen also. And then once I did sort of start to enter the language and live with the language and read the language and try to translate the language, there were these questions of the right, do I have the right to play with this language? Do I have the right to live in this language? Do I have the right to blaspheme in this language and against this language and alongside this language? And ultimately, I think I turned back to the poets again and again and again to see what they were doing, and to see, not to say that I was writing the same work or work that is comparable, but to say that if I felt like I was in conversation with Glatstein and with Margolin and with Leolis and with many of these other poets who I feel like I lived with for a lot of years, just on the page, then that to me was a, at least enough wind in my sails to keep going.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think those were two forms of resistance I encountered, and I'm sure that there are many others that I'll think of as soon as we finish this conversation. I'll write to you, Jerry.
And let's move for like a little bit from different parts of our body. So from the tongue to the heart in this case. So there's also a running theme of the dafik, as you call it, the doifik, the pulse of the heart, the heartbeat in the book that comes back and from throughout the work. And it's interesting because I guess it wouldn't be a Yiddishkayt program if I didn't make a reference to Isaac Deutscher, because I think if we review all of the footage, we'll have a lot of that. But it reminded me of one of his most famous quotes, right, from his "Who is a Jew" talk, and where he says his famous quote is like, religion, I'm an atheist; Jewish nationalism, I'm an internationalist. So in what way then am I a Jew? I am, he says, however, a Jew by force of my unconditional solidarity with the persecuted and the exterminated. And I'm a Jew because I feel the pulse, the dafik of Jewish history. And because I should like to do all that I can to assure the real, not spurious, security and self-respect of Jews. And there is something in your work that's so clear. I mean, it's it's probably one of the most notable features of your work here is this issue of unconditional solidarity and how it's enacted, how it plays out, how it's inscribed in the book, and the ways that you make these links between different types of oppression, that you show that all oppressions are ultimately linked to one another, and you do it through poetry and through the work and through the characters of the book. And I'm really interested also in how that corresponds with the time that you wrote it. But of course, it's not specific to any time. The times that you're reflecting on are a period of intense violence in the world, both in the United States in the 1920s, 30s, also in Europe, as we know, from this period, this pre-Nazi genocidal experience, and in the region that you're talking about, that's today Ukraine. And I'm really fascinated by the way that you wove the present concerns, whether with our characters who represent different modes of whether it's through, I don't want to get too much into giving too much away, but through marginalized women characters for various reasons in this work, queer characters, African American characters, and Jews who have experienced violence and anti-Semitism, and they're all woven together, literally interwoven in it. So I'm wondering how the times that you wrote this impacted, through the period of Trumpism, through the moments of BLM that were unfolding as you were writing this. How did that engrave itself on this and on your imagining of historical trauma and acts of violence?
I think I'll answer that magnificent question by reading a poem that exists in the book. And this is an original piece that sort of the first poem I wrote in Yiddish, and leaned on you a lot in making sure the language is working and finding the best words for it. And here, this is a poem recited at a Communist Party meeting in early 1934 in central Philadelphia by a poet named Anna Trunksboim. And she is directly this triple tribute in my mind to the poet Anna Margolin, to the social activist Anna Strunsky, who was one of the first to report on the anti-Black race massacres in what was called the Red Summer of 1919, the same year that some of these same pogroms were taking place in these areas that became present-day Ukraine or Belarus. She was one of the first to sort of posit that these might be pogroms. And then you fast forward 15 years, and you have many of the most prominent anti-lynching and anti-race massacre thinkers and scholars using this word very directly, saying George Padmore is one who comes to mind, who in his work uses, I think in the early 1930s, uses this word pogrom to describe what's happening in America in this era. So I'll read this poem as a kind of as a diagonal, as a slant answer to your wonderful question. And so the poem, in the scene, the poet translates herself simultaneously, and so reads in Yiddish, then in English, and this is how it appears in the text. Cheshech mein beleter, chob a meise zu der Zeilen. Darkness, my companion, I have a story to tell you. Nächten ist die Frei gekommen zu drucken, ihr Charpe zu mein Erwe, und sie hat gesagt, dass da bin ich beschollen. Yesterday, liberty approached to press her sex upon my sex, telling me that here I am safe. Aber ich hab geschuschket, dass sie darf warten, weil ich hab gehad die Frage von übersetzen. But I whispered to her that she must wait, for I had a question of translation. Hab ich gefragt, wie sagt man pogrom in Amerika? I asked, how do you say pogrom in America? Hat sie geantwortet, and she replied, you say Elaine, you say Rosewood, you say Atlanta, you say St. Louis, you say Tulsa, you say New York, you say Springfield, you say Chicago, you say Corbin, you say Philadelphia. Wie sagt man pogrom in Amerika? You say America. And this is that. This is a conversation with the Deutscher idea, the idea of unconditional solidarity, the idea that that suffering, when turned inward, when framed as if it is utterly unique and utterly disconnected from other forms of oppression, from other forms of racialized and identity-based terrorism and catastrophic massacre and everything that follows. If this oppression is if the wagons are circled and the idea is this is what happened to us, no one else can understand it. No one else. It means nothing to anyone else because the specifics are a little different and because the nuances are different. That to me is a spiritual death. That to me is a betrayal of not what is the essential project of Yiddish, but what was the essential project of many of these Yiddish poets, of many of these Yiddish anarchists, of many of these Yiddish communists. So it's not to say that the language necessarily leads one to this kind of unconditional solidarity, but we saw a lot of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's real, and it's not romanticized, and it's not made up. And you turn to the text, you turn to the poems, you turn to the sort of activist minutes from 1920 and 1930, and you find it there. And for me, that is an essential part of the project of living in Yiddish. And like you said, this novel is not written without the knowledge of what happened in the intervening 70 years. It's not written I'm not pretending that I'm living in 1936 and writing it and hoping that if someone found it, they could actually think this is from 1936. I started writing it in February 2017, right? So what is that? A few weeks after Donald Trump was inaugurated, and wrote it through the entirety of Trump's presidency, wrote it through the early years of the pandemic, wrote it through the uprising for racial justice that began after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. And absolutely the sort of the present moment is interacting with the past, is in conversation with the past, is debating with and pushing against and wrestling with the past. And time, I hope, and I felt at least, bends on itself, isn't such a line. Time is more of a circle, more of a spiral, more of a series of intersecting squiggles than it is a sort of before that is superseded by everything that comes after.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the incredible things I think that captures that the most. Maybe, and I encourage everybody, obviously, to get this book and read it. But that scene, there's a scene in the book where there is a raid on the gay bar, which, and you're very careful, I think, in not being anachronistic in what you term things at the time, and that's clearly deeply researched. And there's this raid, and of course, and our character Leib, who's picked up in this raid, is brought back immediately through the violence that brings him back to the Peckerar pogrom in the woods of his dust village, as you call it, of his shtetl of Zeltelsk, and it's fully interwoven so that the blood coming from his mouth is the same blood. It's the acts of violence, the kicks of the shoes, the person who declares that they are the law. And then, of course, there's this, and then the confrontation that takes place also between a police officer and Charles, who's, trying to intervene, and then is the target of terrible racist abuse by the police. And then again, it's back into the pits of the forest, and that kind of interweaving it's so striking. It really is this. I've never really read anything like that that has tied oppressions together, acts of violence together from the present moment, because everything from the present moment, from the murder of George Floyd and back, is all intertwined in that scene, and it's just brilliant.
And thank you. And that to me is also why I turn to poetry again and again. That the op-ed version of that would be boring. Because either I'd have to say, here's all the ways that they're the same, or I'd have to say, here are all the ways that they're different, or I'd have to qualify and explain. And instead, if it's okay, maybe I'll just read this part of the section that you mentioned, the sort of what becomes like a poem where Leib is being picked up. He's been entrapped by a man who pretends to be one of the queer members of this underground community, and instead is actually an undercover police officer. Like you said, the word gay wasn't in existence. Even the category of homosexual hadn't yet really been created in America. It was just in the process of being formed. At this point, it was men who slept with men. It was Fageles was a word that was in use. Queer was a word that was in use. There are different terms and different labels for different people. But so Leib is grabbed by this man, and the voices that are coming in a different, I'll do them in a little bit of a different intonation. These are the voices of the Malachim. They come in italics, and these are the only italics in the book. They are not italicized because they're in Yiddish. They're italicized because they are coming from a different realm. And they speak in the voices of Leib's and Gittel's siblings. Here it's Leib's siblings. And it goes like this. All around Zeltelsk now, they were coming. Yeah, it was morning. It was morning in Zeltelsk. And they began grabbing at the men what were just before this praying. Yeah, the men, they were walking from the shill. Talesim neatly folded after dawn time prayer. Together in the back room of smoke and hope, the men, they had been shuckling their hips, as elsewhere in Zatelsk the women also were. What were just before this laughing and leaning onto one another's necks? They were singing, they were all singing. What were singing to each other on the back of the music, and they said to everyone, they said to gather together back inside the shill. They went from house to say it. Perverts, goddamn inverts, and everyone began to run and also to wail. But no one was running, though all could see their tusks jutting from their bellies, could taste the specific way the clan of death sang as they walked throughout Zatelsk. And the men, what came inside, stood still and watched as the prayer shawls slid from the bared shoulders of all the men who had already been inside, and all this fabric curled up there on the ground and wilted. And as the worshippers ran by them, the men would had come inside, grabbed for them, and they placed their hands on the men in the shill. They led the first group and pulled them into the forest, into the forest. They pulled everyone into the forest, and everywhere there was dust.
It's and the way that it ties back to the repeat of this idea of the dust village, the dust that emerges, the dust of history, the debris. It's stunning. And I let's turn to the dust village a little bit. We're low on time, but I want to make sure we talk a little bit about the experience of of Zatelsk, how that gets materialized both in the work, but also your experience of visiting an ancestral dust village, let's say. And there are these moments in the book that repeat also. There are these beautiful refrains where you say, Zatelsk is Jewish for this. Zatelsk is Jewish for this. It becomes this kind of stand-in, this keyword for a whole series of things in the Jewish experience, but not only, obviously, in the Jewish experience, but in the experience of living in a violent and destructive world. And yeah, the idea of it has at the heart of it this word tell, the idea of machen a telefon, making a ruin of, making a disaster of. And so there's the disaster at the center of this word, this town. And maybe you could talk a little bit both about, what it means to form, to envision, to create an idea of Zatelsk, and also maybe a little bit about what it meant to visit and to be in a place where which was a modeling for that.
Yeah, so as you were saying that, I was remembering a few of the ones that come up in the book, and you're right, there are a lot of these refrains, but it's Jewish for an endless circle, Jewish for a mound of upground carp, Jewish for a lack of options, Jewish for what stands or falls beyond catastrophe. And those are, of course, interspersed throughout the text. And so this question, when thinking about this in the context of our conversation and of our time, so the cover of this book, you can see, has this stand of trees. And these trees are directly taken from a photograph I snapped on my iPhone just as our bus was pulling up to Uzliani, to a former shtetl in central Belarus, not so far from Minsk, where my great-grandparents grew up.
I think we might have a photo of that same thing that I took. This is not the one, but there's one of the trees too. I took this one too, but I took a lot of pictures of you during our time there. But there's also, I think, a picture included in this set of pictures of that same stand of trees. But yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, I love that. I love seeing that photo. It feels like it was 17 years ago. That was right before the pandemic and before a lot of things. But time, as I said, bends on itself. And that was the experience there of being in this village where, on one hand, we went to this sprawling former cemetery. And we did what we did in a lot of these villages and former shtetls, which was to look at the headstones, which were scattered all around, and to try to pour flour onto them and see if we could decipher the Hebrew and the Yiddish engraved thereupon. And often we could. I didn't find the specific graves of my ancestors, but what I did find instead was this field filled with insects and sorrel, and thyme and wild horseradish and mint. And at the edge of the field, there was this little murkish river. And I ran through the field and imagined my great grandparents walking or even maybe running through the same field. And time felt like it was bending on itself. And it felt like there was this expansiveness and this encirclement. And of course, also in this field is a memorial statue, which says in Yiddish, in the Soviet orthography of the Yiddish, this is a memorial of I think it was 342 Jews of Uzliani who were killed in a single day when the Nazis came. And it was, it's dumb luck that my family was out a few decades earlier, right? They made it to America. And so at that point, they weren't there. But the people in that field who were killed on that one day were certainly their former lovers or their former rivals or the people they resented or the people they haggled with or the people they tickled or the people they learned from. And for me, that day also stands very centrally in my imagination of Zatelsk. It stands very centrally in my conversation with my actual family, with my familial ancestors, in addition to this family of poets that I've found. And it was something there. It was something of this, because you and I collectively created the name of Zatelsk. I asked you, what would be a good Yiddish word for something like catastrophe, and we settled on tel. And I wanted the suffix, the sk suffix, the common Slavic suffix you'll hear in this area. And so I said, what about Telsk? And you said, it's nice, but what if it was Zatelsk? Za being the Slavic preface for beyond. And of course, that immediately was electrifying because of the possibility of a multiplicity of meanings, right? Beyond catastrophe, in the sense that to think about every single Jew in a village murdered in a pit in a single day is beyond catastrophe. The word catastrophe doesn't sufficiently hold even a modicum of that. And so in this book, there is a long series where Gittel tries and fails to even tell a one-word story about all the 296 members of her community of Zatelsk who were killed. She can't even tell a single line about each. Eventually, it devolves into another Jew which wasn't alive anymore, Burich Dayan Ho'emes, and her siblings say, Omein, 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 Omein. And so beyond catastrophe in that sense, but also in the sense that only if time is a line can catastrophe be the only story, right? Only if we say that the present necessarily supersedes, defeats, gobbles up, and is superior to everything that came before, then catastrophe is the only story. Then catastrophe is the only story about the Jewish experience in Uzliani. It is the only story about the Jewish experience in Europe. It is the only story about the Jewish experience, about the sort of where the Yiddish language arrived. But if we allow, as poetry invites us to, as walking through these fields invite us to, if we allow for a simultaneity of these crickets and of the mint and of the sorrel and of the river and of the headstones and of the mass murder and of what came before and of what came after, and not to say that one supersedes the other or that the before is superior to the after or the after is superior to the before, but rather it becomes this mishmash, to use a common Yiddish calque or Yiddish word that's actually made its way into English. It's this running along the seams of the things. It's this translation between catastrophe and also survival. This translation between catastrophe and what is further past. And so I think that in some ways it all circles back onto itself.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, and I recognize that we're out of time. I know we could talk for a day or more or a year or 5 more years about it. But I also just want to, it reminds me so starkly of one of our, of our great other Kadoshim, our holy saints. And to paraphrase also about the Geschichte Malach, the angel of history. And it seems like that's a lot of what you're doing here, collecting all this debris. And as it continues to mount in front of us as a continuous pile, a continuous tell that we reach down into and can only pull those fragments out and try to sew them together. And I thank you for this book, and I thank you for being with us here tonight and joining us in conversation. And I recommend everyone goes out and gets the book. It's also available on Audible, which I listened to a lot of it today. It's excellent. Moriel reads it and sings on it, which is incredible. So I highly recommend that too. And I'd also like to thank Moriel, and thank all the people behind the scenes here tonight. Lisa Kenner Grissom, who is always doing an excellent job putting together all of our live programs, and for Claire Fester for filling in with technical assistance at the very last minute. Thank you, Claire. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And stay tuned and keep track of other Yiddishkayt programs over the course of this next year. Thank you all. Again, Novin. Good night. Thanks very much.
Good night.